Chapter 10. The Architecture of Suffering, Disorders, Tribalism, and more. In the conscious phase shift, do not view mental health through the lens of brokenness. You have to view it through the lens of calibration. When the biological hardware is subjected to enough high noise, trauma, social friction, or status threats, it develops specialized survival scripts. These scripts are efficient in the short term, but they create massive resource leaks over a lifetime. In my time in the pharmaceutical industry and customer service, I noticed that many disorders are actually just the biological hardware running a survival script in the wrong environment. When the conscious phase shift doesn't happen, the energy that should go toward progress turns inward, creating the rot. Conscious phase shift, disruption in disorders, the alarm, and the shutdown. Anxiety, the high-frequency state where the amygdala is stuck in a loop of anticipating the next status threat. The system is overclocked, leading to physical wear and tear on the hardware. If jealousy is a resource leak, then anxiety is the sound of the alarm system being stuck in the on position. When we are constantly comparing our status to others, the jealousy loop, our amygdala is in a state of chronic hijack. This persistent flood of cortisol leads to the system freeze we call anxiety. Depression, the low-frequency state. When the brain decides it can no longer win the status game, it initiates a total system shutdown. It is a safe mode designed to prevent further resource loss by withdrawing from the field entirely. Often, this is the brain's way of shutting down to prevent further status loss. If the ego feels it can no longer win the zero-sum game of life, it withdraws entirely to conserve resources. Narcissistic personality disorder, NPD, the infinite firewall. In the conscious phase shift, this state is not described as a system crash, but as a high-performance defensive partition built around deep emotional wounds. When the biological hardware encounters a threat environment where status is the only currency for survival, the brain initiates a preemptive script. The connection. The individual has an exceptionally sensitive status alarm. To the brain, any drop in relative standing feels like a threat to the organism's total integrity. To manage this, the hardware builds a cognitive firewall. This firewall acts as a real-time filter. It prioritizes data that confirms the individual's competence and utility, the hero script, while silently redirecting or deleting data that suggests a vulnerability. The resource leak. Because this firewall is always on, it requires a high amount of metabolic and social energy to maintain. The internal status battery has a high discharge rate. It needs constant external validation to remain stable. This creates a constant feed requirement. The individual isn't necessarily draining others to be malicious. They are most likely attempting to keep their internal status meter at a functional baseline so the system doesn't trigger a catastrophic shutdown. If anxiety is a stuck alarm, narcissism is a perpetual script. OCD, obsessive-compulsive disorder, the hypercalibration glitch. In the conscious phase shift, OCD is not just about cleaning or checking, but as a desperate attempt to lower the high noise of a chaotic environment. The connection. When the world feels unpredictable, high noise, the brain's detection hardware goes into overdrive. It begins to treat small, irrelevant details, like a crooked picture or an unwashed hand, as critical system errors. The mechanical logic. The compulsion is a manual attempt to reset the baseline. By performing a ritual, the brain gets a momentary status win over the chaos. It's a person trying to square a world that feels leaning, but because the leak is internal, anxiety, jealousy, no amount of external straightening ever fixes the signal. ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. The signal-to-noise saturation. A DHD can be viewed as a hardware sensitivity issue. The brain's antenna is too wide, and the filter is too weak. The connection. Most people can filter out low-level noise to focus on a single data stream. The ADHD brain, however, treats every stimulus, a bird outside, a notification, a stray thought, as having equal priority status. The resource leak. Because the brain is constantly scanning for a new dopamine resource, it cannot settle on a long-term deduction. It is in a state of perpetual phase shift interference. In a world designed by predatory marketing to grab attention, the ADHD brain is constantly being hijacked by external scripts, making it nearly impossible to maintain an internal focus. Bipolar disorder, the frequency oscillation. Error. This is perhaps the most literal representation of a phase issue. The connection, mania. The brain enters a state of false super-radiance. It believes it has reached the ultimate truth and has infinite status. The status alarm is completely silenced, leading to reckless behavior because the brain no longer perceives resource threats. Depression, the status crash. After the high frequency of mania, the system realizes the data doesn't match reality. The amygdala overcorrects, slamming the system into a resource conservation shutdown to protect what's left of the ego. Summary: the rot as a system multiplier. In the conscious phase shift theory, it is critical to distinguish between biological hardware and environmental interference. Jealousy is not the cause of mental disorders. These are often rooted in genetic calibration or chemical imbalances. However, the rot, chronic jealousy, acts as a primary system multiplier. It is the high-frequency noise that prevents the brain from stabilizing its own signals. When the status alarm is constantly firing, it places an immense cognitive load on an already struggling system. It forces the brain to divert resources away from healing and toward a futile status defense, making every existing disorder more volatile and harder to manage. The influence on specific architectures. In anxiety, jealousy is the fuel for the fire. If anxiety is a stuck alarm, jealousy is the intruder. The alarm thinks it sees in every room. It keeps the system in a state of chronic hypervigilance, preventing the amygdala from ever reaching a safe baseline. In depression, jealousy acts as the weight. When the system is already in a resource conservation shutdown, the sight of others' high-status lives confirms the brain's internal script of failure. It turns sadness into a permanent status collapse. In NPD, the firewall isn't created by jealousy, but it is maintained by it. The constant threat of a status drop forces the firewall to remain impenetrable, preventing the individual from ever processing reality or achieving an authentic connection. In ADHD, jealousy is the signal hijacker. The brain is already struggling to filter data. When the sting of comparison enters the field, it becomes the loudest frequency in the room, making it impossible to focus on the ultimate truth of the task at hand. In OCD, jealousy acts as the loop lock. OCD is a functional error in the brain's system check, where it creates repetitive compulsions to simulate environmental control. When the rot enters this system, the compulsion often shifts toward status checking. You see a rival succeed, and your hardware refuses to let the wave pass. Instead, you enter a cycle of monitoring their metrics, comparing your behind the scenes to their highlight reel, and mentally rehearsing the sting to achieve a temporary but fleeting sense of parity. In bipolar disorder, jealousy acts as the oscillation catalyst. Because this hardware swings between overclocking, mania, and system shutdown, depression, the prime mover accelerates the shift. During a high, jealousy is used as a competitive firewall to outsignal everyone else. When the crash inevitably happens, seeing the high-status data points of others becomes a lethal weight. It triggers a total status collapse, where the brain decides it can no longer compete in the hierarchy and remains in shutdown to protect its remaining ego resources. The deduction, the feedback loop. Ultimately, the rot creates a feedback loop of miscalibration. A person struggling with a disorder is already dealing with internal noise. When they add the external noise of jealousy, the system reaches a point of saturation. The goal of the conscious phase shift isn't to cure the disorder. That is a medical process. The goal is to deduce the interference. By removing the weight of the rot, you lower the total noise in the system, allowing the individual's hardware to function at its highest possible calibration, despite its inherent glitches. Acknowledging the rot in other areas, racism and tribalism, the macro leak. We must be brave enough to deduce the root of our greatest social failures. Racism is not a logic-based ideology. It is a biological friction point. It can be boiled down to a primitive, collective form of jealousy. It is the fear that another tribe will replace my tribe in the hierarchy of resources and status. By dehumanizing the other, the brain attempts to delete the rival script, much like the burning of the Library of Alexandria. The tribal alarm, racism, and the fear of replacement. When we look at historical and modern movements, from the civil rights era of Martin Luther King Jr. to current immigration and Islamophobia, we are seeing the prime mover, jealousy, operating on a massive tribal scale. 1. The zero-sum fallacy, immigration and family separation. The hatred directed at immigrants is almost always a jealousy of resource stability. The logic. The established group perceives the arrival of a new group as a direct threat to their status buffer. Even if there is enough for everyone, the primitive brain interprets a new neighbor as a potential thief of food, jobs, or safety. The sting. Ripping families apart at borders or dehumanizing the outsider is a violent attempt to lower the status of the newcomer so far that they are no longer viewed as a rival signal. It is the most extreme form of status management through destruction. 2. The jealousy of the moral high ground, MLK and BLM. Why is there such a violent reaction to movements like Black Lives Matter or the work of MLK? It is often a jealousy of moral authority. The reaction: when an oppressed group demands equality, the dominant group feels a status drop. They feel as if their place in line is being taken. The mechanism. To the conformist brain, someone else's gain in rights feels like their personal loss in value. They are jealous of the autonomy and momentum of the movement. To stop the sting of their own guilt or perceived loss, they attempt to devalue the signal by labeling the movement as dangerous or criminal. 3. Islamophobia and the identity shield. Hatred of different religious groups is often a jealousy of certainty in the conflict. If a group, like Islamic communities, possesses a strong, unified identity and a clear moral code, it can trigger a status threat in a Western society that feels culturally fractured. The deduction. The hate is a defensive script. By attacking the other's values, the observer is trying to prove that their own legacy OS is superior. They are jealous of the social cohesion they see in the other. The unified deduction, the other as a mirror. In all these cases, racism, sexism, or bigotry, the person expressing the hate is actually confessing a deep insecurity. If I have to keep you down to feel up, I have already admitted that you are a threat to my status. The racist is jealous of the potential for the other to outperform them. The bigot is jealous of the freedom the other has to live outside the bigot's rigid rules. The conscious phase shift solution. A conscious individual recognizes that human rights are not a zero-sum resource. Someone else gaining status does not mechanically lower yours. When you see a group alarm firing, like a political riot or a xenophobic policy, you are seeing a mass of people whose status alarms are being manipulated by the rot. When we move to a conscious phase shift, there is no other tribe. There is only a single species currently suffering from a shared biological glitch. The symmetry of hate, the shadow of the bigot. It is easy to categorize racism and bigotry as the problem, but for the conscious phase shift to be complete, we must also diagnose the reaction to that behavior. While the actions of a bigot are objectively unhelpful to a functioning civilization, the hate directed back at them is still fueled by the prime mover. The jealousy of the unfettered, the rule breaker sting. When you see someone acting out in a bigoted, sexist, or racist way, your fairness calibration fires a warning shot. The social script: I hate them because they are a primitive, hateful person who is holding back progress. The root deduction: jealousy of social lawlessness. You have spent your life polishing your signal, learning to be empathetic, inclusive, and socially calibrated. When you see someone getting away with being a bad person, your brain registers a status threat. The sting: it is the same frequency as the street bike. You are subconsciously jealous that they are allowed to ignore the social contract that you work so hard to maintain. You feel that by them winning, getting attention or power through cheating, bigotry, your honest social investment is being devalued. The trap of the moral high ground. When we hate the bigot, we are attempting to use status destruction to fix our own internal discomfort. We try to lower their status to subhuman so we can feel high status in our morality. The friction. This creates a closed loop. The bigot is jealous of your progress. You are jealous of their lawlessness. Both sides are now operating on the exact same frequency of the rot. The result. You aren't solving the bigotry. You are feeding the machine. You have allowed a bad person to dictate your internal state. You are now leaking resources into a moral war instead of focusing on utility. De-escalating the mirror. A person who has achieved the conscious phase shift looks at a bigot and doesn't see an enemy to be hated. They see a broken machine. The deduction. The bigot is trapped in a legacy OS of fear and resource guarding. If you react with hate, you are admitting that their behavior has the power to lower your status. The moment you see their bigotry as a confession of their own jealousy, you no longer feel the need to hate them back. You move to a state of clinical indifference. You deal with the behavior as a technical obstacle to be moved, not a personal threat to be fought. I cannot be jealous of a person who is burning down their own house just to keep me from sitting on their porch.